It's recording. So, you worked at a school in New York during 9/11. What was the school?
I worked at Berkeley Carroll School in Brooklyn.
What age and subject did you teach?
I was a first grade teacher, so they were 7-year-olds.
Oh, that's young.
Yes.
How did you find out what happened?
So we had a swimming pool, and the kids had swimming time, and we were coming up from the basement, and another PE teacher was coming downstairs and said that a plane had hit the Twin Towers, and I figured it was a puddle jumper, a little Cessna, because something like that had happened in the past. And so I went up to my classroom and logged onto my computer just as the kids were settling in to check email, and I had all these New York Times alerts on my email about the plane accident. And then I looked out the window, and our window of the classroom overlooked Lower Manhattan, and all I saw was smoke coming. And lowered the shade and started reading more in depth about what had happened.
So were you with your students when you found out, or were they like...
Yeah, I was on the stairwell going up when I first heard about it, and then once we figured out what was going on, the students were in the classroom, and this was very early in the school year, so I didn't know a lot of them well, and we were working on the letter C, learning the sound and the writing of the letter C that day. So while we were trying to figure out the seriousness of it and go online to see what we could find out about it, my teaching assistant was putting out snack for the kids to eat, so it was a very strange moment.
So did you not tell them right away? You just didn't...
We didn't tell them at all. We started, the teachers were being called down to the director's office to go over quickly the plan of how we weren't going to tell the kids what was going on. The building I was in was first grade through fourth grade, so they were very young, and they were in the process of trying to figure out what to do and what it was going to look like when parents started coming for their kids to pick them up.
What was the general feeling both in the city and in the school when that day and when you found out?
Well, in the school, it was it would only be when we could get together to talk about what we were going to do and how we were going to get the kids home that you could feel anything, because otherwise in the classroom, I was showing pictures from my honeymoon because I had gone to Alaska, and I was just showing the kids the difference between icebergs and growlers and just trying to make up what to do, because we couldn't concentrate on the letter C anymore, and there were a lot of interruptions with intercoms calling kids down when parents arrived, and I would sneak away when my assistant was in the room, because my husband and I traveled to Manhattan. We lived in Jersey City, which was on the other side of Lower Manhattan. We went through Lower Manhattan to get to our jobs, and so I wanted to make sure. I called him and said, there's crazy stuff going on at World Trade Center. Don't take the PATH train there. And then one of my brothers called the school to talk to me because he had heard that our father was flying out that day. And so it was just all of us sort of taking turns at the library phone, trying to figure out what was going on our home lives, while parents were trying to figure out how to get their kids and bring them home. And as each parent came and we might steal a quick moment with them, we were hearing about what was really going on in the outside world, because we were pretty much a bubble unless I could look at New York Times online and peek out my window. And then we could start hearing the jets coming in, and so that was a very different sound, because at that point we knew 2 planes had hit, and then you didn't know what plane was there for good and what plane was you were hearing was for evil. And so it just became so surreal. And so as we let more and more children go home, the parents that were coming for them had walked further and further to get there over the Brooklyn Bridge, coming from their work in Manhattan. And near the end of the morning and into the early afternoon, they were coming covered in dust. And just because it took them longer. And
do you think any of the kids kind of suspected what was going on or knew that something different was happening and that it wasn't a good situation?
They could tell something was going on because their classmates were leaving before they were supposed to. They knew they hadn't had lunch yet. I worked with the youngest grade in the school, and so concept of time is kind of lost on them. But when they were understanding more and more kids were leaving and they hadn't had lunch yet, I started saying things like, there was an accident in Manhattan and it's making travel very difficult. And so parents who can come get their kids now are going to do that to alleviate the traffic of everyone all at once. I was super vague about it. And one of my students, who I couldn't stand, went downstairs when his parents arrived, asked them what was going on, and came running, screaming back up the stairs to tell everyone what was really going on. And it's for that reason my husband wanted to name our son Ian, and I said, no, I do not like Ian. But and which is a normal child reaction, getting to be the first to know, getting to share the news first. But it was unsettling, but luckily he was one of the last few to get picked up, and it was easier to have a more comfortable conversation with a smaller group of kids.
So he ended up telling them?
He was just sort of screaming it through the school, just running around. That was his reaction to it, which is a valid reaction, and I make the joke about not liking him. He wasn't one of my favorite students, but that was his reaction. Everyone was reacting so differently. It's more, I don't think the parents, it should not have been a split-second answer to him in a hallway of a school, but it was what it was. But that was my first experience of panic. That was the first panicked voice I heard about everything, because when I got in touch with my husband before that, he was telling me what had happened, but in such a detached voice, because he didn't get on the train, and he and his brother, who was staying with us at the time, were just sitting out by the our apartment building overlooked Lower Manhattan, and they were just standing out by the water. And he was letting me know early on that there was 2 planes, and then he let me know when they fell. So, but again, you couldn't believe it was going on, and our reactions were very low, and this child's reaction was very high. It was my first encounter with the angst of what was going on in the city.
How did you explain to the other students who were there when you told them? How did you calm them down and explain?
I was able to say something to the effect of, wow, Ian sounds very upset. I get it sounds like the accident is pretty bad. I don't think a lot of people are out after us like he thought. I said, I think there was an accident with the buildings, and but I know that your parents are on their way. I just kept it very neutral. Because I think they also understood that kids could be confused in what they were saying, and a very calm adult was just like, I don't know why he's saying that. Maybe we'll learn more once we get home and we can watch the news. But until then, have another hi-ho cracker.
How did you keep your students calm, before when people started leaving and stuff? And
yeah, that was, thank goodness for my honeymoon photo album. I showed them pictures and talked about what it was like in Alaska. And because this was so early in the school year, I worked at a private school then. And so we were probably a fourth or fifth day into the school year. And so we could use a lot of that time for just talking about what did you do this summer, and how many siblings do you have, just sort of more getting to know each other. They could draw, they could build, and we just kept it low key in the room. And my assistant teacher and I often put on music. We put on music, and yeah, just sort of, it looks like Molly's mom's here. All right, we'll see you later. Just kept it. This is a strange day, but with a normal tone.
Did you have any students whose family was like affected, like in the towers or in the air or something, where they couldn't get to the school?
Everyone was able to be picked up in our classroom. My my classroom was attached to the second grade classroom, and a child in that room lost his father, who was a chef at Windows on the World, which was a restaurant at the top of the one of the Twin Towers. So he was affected by it. His mom was able to come and get him, but and they had to wait. They didn't. When she picked him up, she had no idea her husband was gone. Nobody knew who got out and who survived at that point. But we learned about it the next day.
Did you know anybody who was in the towers or like in the air during that day?
Yeah, there was a family I babysat for, and the father and his brother both worked at a financial company, and they were both killed.
Oh boy. What were your feelings of what happened during that day, like when you got home, or like just like in the classroom and stuff?
Once the kids were taken care of and were gone, then my anxiety picked up, because I knew that for me to get home, I had to go through Lower Manhattan, and I had to figure out a way to get home that wasn't Lower Manhattan. And there was another colleague who lived in a similar part of New Jersey as I did. So we went into the teacher room to grab our lunches out of the fridge that were never eaten. And there were a lot of teachers in there who lived locally, who walked to work or were within Brooklyn. And they started giving us their uneaten lunches, because they said, you don't know, it could take you 12 hours to get home. And it just, at that moment, people felt they had to give us their bananas and bagels, and they just didn't know what was ahead of us, and nor did we. At that point, the phones weren't working anymore, so I couldn't call my husband and get a feel of what was going on and where we lived. So that's when the anxiety picked up. Will I be able to get home? And we rerouted ourselves a bit, and the PATH train, we went to Midtown Manhattan instead of through Lower Manhattan, and the PATH train was able to take us back into Jersey, and it was when I came out of our PATH station stop that I had an idea of what happened, because there were papers blowing and sticking to me that were coming from the Twin Towers. So they had taken their time floating across the water, and were all through our courtyard, and the smoke and the smell was there, which I didn't experience until then. I saw the smoke from my classroom and my walk to the subway, but we were so close to Lower Manhattan that it was the smell and the smoke, and people's memos and letters were flying all along and sticking to my legs. And then when I got into my apartment building, a bunch of people who live there were gathering and trying to come up with a sign-in sheet so we could know who came back and who didn't, because we needed to know who had pets in their apartments that would need caring, and just get a sense of how many were missing, because at that time, I think what was pressed upon people the most was to try to figure out and count who was present and who was not, because they were also trying to get a count of how many people were lost or missing. So that's when it was very strange. And then I reconnected with my husband and my brother-in-law. And we just sort of wandered around and we watched everything, and being all together brought calmness again. And we just watched where the buildings were and the smoke most of the evening. And then we finally went inside and the phone started ringing, and it was my dad. And that's when I fell apart.
How long did it take you to like get home from school?
I don't think it was that. Probably 2.5 hours. And considering the fact that my commute then was about 45 minutes, it wasn't that bad. When we got into the PATH station at 34th Street, we couldn't even believe that they were running. And in fact, they weren't. We got there and there was a huge crowd in front of us, and all of a sudden the doors opened and people got on the train. And so it probably took us 1 or 2 PATH trains cycling through to get on, but the fact that they started running was amazing. And then I don't know how long we were rerouted, but then we would go by the World Trade Center stop, not the PATH train center. That was demolished because that was in the Twin Towers, but through Lower Manhattan on the subways, they would go into the middle row of tracks, and you could just see this abandoned subway station that was intact but just couldn't be used. It wasn't safe. They were rebuilding up above, so that was pretty haunting. But I was surprised to how quickly, how I did not expect to get home that quickly at all.
When you left the school, how different was the environment from the school, like having to be quiet about it and not say anything, to every basically chaos?
Well, coming out into Brooklyn was very quiet, and that's where my school was. And then walking to the subway and getting on a subway to go to Midtown Manhattan, everyone on the subway was quiet and calm. That we were in this bubble of calmness because we weren't in Manhattan, I think. And the moment that we were in Manhattan was in a train station, a PATH station, where everyone was of the same mind. Everyone was trying to get home or get to where they needed to be. And for a New York City subway, there was a ton of eye contact, which is very different than what you normally experience. So again, it was almost soothing and surreal. And people nodded at each other, and it was, and I'm sure people in Boston experienced this with the marathon bombing. You just suddenly become so gentle and respectful of each other.
Like a community?
Yeah, and because you were up against something huge together, and all the silly little things fall away, and it's just the appreciation of being okay and the pride in your city. That was my experience until I got home, and then in my apartment building was very business, which I appreciated. And then it was people all along the waterfront were watching the buildings with us. It was people we didn't know. You talked to anyone. Again, it was that sense of community. It was interesting to watch footage later. There was a camera crew on Fifth Avenue around Union Square where I used to work at Barnes & Noble, and one of my coworkers was being interviewed, and people were just standing in the middle of the street because there was no traffic moving. So she was standing in the middle of Fifth Ave and looking downtown and saying, you know, that how they were just completely gone. And I think being in Lower Manhattan probably would have had an extremely different feel than what we felt in other boroughs.
Was there any like blame? Do you think that see anybody blaming people or like a group, like the Taliban or something?
I didn't experience or notice any of that. No, I didn't, and it doesn't mean it didn't exist. I mean, my world was very small there. It was my husband, and it was work and work community, and so.
You mentioned your dad earlier, and if you don't want to talk about it, that's okay. But like, why was it his phone call that like kind of like brought you to like emotional?
I guess because it was, I'm not an adult when I'm with my parents, you know. I mean, now I am more that my mom is older, my father is gone. But if your dad calls you, you don't have to be the grown up anymore. And that was a day. It was hard to be an adult. It was wonderful at moments, knowing what I was reading online and then looking at these faces that knew nothing that was going on. You know, there's that ignorance is blissful. And then when my dad called, it just let all the adulting crumble, and because he was there, I was allowed to feel. It was the first moment I felt anything other than awe and confusion. It was the moment that I could say that I was scared. And he could say, of course you're scared, you know. And it was just very simplistic thinking. There wasn't higher order thinking and being in charge of anything. It was just the moment I can turn into myself and understand that I was scared, and that I didn't like what was going on at all, and I was vulnerable. And my husband's father was a fireman at the time, and we knew he was there, so that was scary. And my brother Brendan walks towards destruction all the time, and he was there helping to find people. And it felt like it was going to take up too much of my life, what was going on, too many parts of it.
How long do you think that the surreality of the situation and like how like New York kind of felt like a community, how long would you say that you felt that lasted after what happened?
I would say a few months. Certainly, they're always on the subway, you know, and I know you take the subways in New York, and all of a sudden there'll be a bump or a light will flicker. All eyes were on each other, and not because you were afraid someone was going to suddenly jump up and do a striptease in front of you, but because you were just sort of checking in. Are we all okay? Are we scared? How are we feeling? There were constant jets overhead, and so I remember I would go to my coworker's apartment after work on Fridays, and we'd sit and chat, have a couple of beers, and then you just, you know, laughing, having a good time, and then all of a sudden a jet would go overhead, and it was this interruption of what's a typical day in the life. So you realize that it was always still around you. And then our school building was next to a church. And the amount of funerals that were needed for firemen and policemen took months to get through. And so about twice a week for a month and a half, the church next to our school was used for a funeral. And so I'd be in the middle of a lesson, about circumference and pumpkins and estimating how many pumpkin seeds there were in our classroom pumpkin, and the bagpipes would start. And then I would be teaching, but my eyes would be streaming because, my Celtic pride, and because it was another person being laid to rest who had been waiting a while to be laid to rest, because at that far out you knew it was that they couldn't find them. And sometimes they would dig and work until they could find a piece of something, whether it was that was identifiable, that they could then have their funeral. So it went on for a while. It was quite the process. And then St. Patrick's Day parade, by then most people were back to being who they were, because that was many months out. But I remember watching the parade, and then you have all the policemen marching through and all the firemen marching through, and then at the same time all the music stopped and they did an about face down towards Lower Manhattan, and no dry eye in the crowd. Everyone was crying, and then it was that unification again, about all of us were in this together.
So would you say that by like March and stuff, the city had like kind of not like gone back to normal, because you can't like be normal after that, but
right,
kind of started to get back into a routine?
Definitely. As far as I could see, I'm sure because I didn't work in Lower Manhattan, I'm sure life was very strange for people in the financial district, and all the businesses that were there. I'm sure life was very strange for those who worked in airports and bus stations and train stations. I mean, all our garbage cans went away. That was very strange, to have Manhattan not have a single garbage can.
Where did you throw your trash?
That's what it was. It was weird. Eventually they got these bags, I think, that would hang on a frame, because they wanted to be able to see, to make sure no one was placing bombs and things. So it would take a while to find a place. And I don't remember the date, and maybe you can look this up, but Saturday Night Live came back on, and they had Rudy Giuliani on. They had Paul Simon sing the Boxer as a tribute to New York City, and then they had Rudy Giuliani came on, and Lorne Michaels asked him, "Can we be funny yet? Are we allowed to be funny?" To get the permission that, because there was definitely a long period of time where you felt that you had to mourn, and you had to be serious and thoughtful and respectful and scared and wary, and so it was just the perfect way to do it. I so appreciated that episode, because there is that awkward time. I mean, even if you're at a family funeral, you're like, and you start to laugh, you feel very strange about it. So he gave permission for New York to laugh again. And Broadway was dark for a long time, and my brother-in-law lost his job because he worked at a restaurant that served people who were going to the theater. So he was let go, and he moved away, and so the city was definitely affected for a while. The students were affected for a while in my classroom, and just when you thought it was over, it's like then St. Patrick's Day, all of a sudden you're caught up in it again. It was in the spring that I would take the first grade class. We would do a unit on New York City, and so we would do a field trip to the 5 boroughs, and we'd walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. We would go to Queens, where they had a model of New York City that was under glass that you could walk on top of. So going there, it was they had a ribbon around the Twin Towers because they still had the Twin Towers in their model, and they weren't there. And so the kids, you could tell that the kids felt that a lot. A lot of them would lie down with their foreheads on the glass to look down at the towers, and you're never sure how much children are affected by things. And it's moments like that that you see it. You know, they're just sort of gazing at what was once there. They might have never even been to the towers, but they knew that it was a loss, and they knew that it was an area where you should be gentle. And so that was lovely. And then with that unit, I would do a lot of building in my classroom with blocks, and this little boy Tim was building with Legos, and he came up to me and he just said, I wish the Twin Towers were made of Legos, because look, I just build them again like this. Why couldn't they be made of Legos? And and that's the moment you realize that your tears were never far behind. I think there was a fragility that lasted a long time, and to this day. I know that there's a play out now on Broadway. It was across from...
Come From Away.
Yeah. And so I was just there watching Dear Evan Hansen. It was across the street. And my friend was telling me about it. And then yesterday in the car, I'm listening to Sirius Radio Broadway music, and a song from that play came on, and it was moving. And my kids were like, turn it off. And I was like, you got to understand, this is big. This is big in our lifetime. In my lifetime as a almost 45-year-old, we had Desert Storm as our war, which was tragic, and all the places we go to help others, and loss is tragic. But I think it was the fact that this was not in any way organized by us. This was an attack on New York City. It's the biggest event in my generation's life as of now, and let's keep it that way. Thank you very much.
Did you find it hard to keep teaching and teaching what you usually did, and keeping up with curriculum, and to get the kids' attention after?
I didn't. I found it very grounding to be with children, because they can pass from one thing to another so very easily. So even Tim saying he wished the buildings were made of Legos, my assistant Debbie and I were caught in that and choked. And he was, the next thing, throwing something at a kid, and then we're like, all right, Tim, come back here. You're not allowed to throw blocks at someone's head. So they could pass from one thing right to another. Found it very grounding. I was concerned about the New York City unit. There were definitely things we couldn't do that we had done before. I think that year it was a lot more bells and whistles to be able to go on the Staten Island ferry. And walking across the Brooklyn Bridge. I'm trying to think of that year, if we were able to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. I can't remember. But there was definitely concern about it, because anytime you'd give a lesson, and I would do mapping lessons, and I had these little subway maps, and the morning warm-up, I would say, all right, I'm at the Bronx Zoo, but I got to get to 42nd Street, Times Square shuttle. What should I do? And just the kids who were there while waiting for others to come in would just look at the subway lines or bus lines and how to get from one place to another. And, there'd always be one kid, good thing we don't have to go into Lower Manhattan. You're like, stop talking about it. It was definitely a part of our everyday.
Well, I think that's all the questions that I have. So, anything else you would like to add that you think is important about 9/11 and the experience?
Wow, that's no pressure or anything. I can't think of anything. I think I appreciate that people are still talking about it, and I hear old people talking about the importance of this war and that war and this event, and you can get so distant from it, which is natural, but it can feel almost disrespectful when people do. And so it's interesting because this is the second interview in a year that I've done about 9/11, and so I appreciate that people know the significance of it. And it certainly wasn't more lives lost that day than in wars and other events in life, but I think a big part of it for America was that the rug was pulled out from under us. So I think it has so many feelings attached to it. And so I thank you for writing about it and interviewing me.
Thank you for being interviewed.